Before the documentary begins, I would like to provide a brief in a few lines first on the title, Mongol Empire, The Untold Secrets of Genghis Khan's Ruthless Rise and Mysterious Legacy. The wind howls across a frozen plain. A lone rider cuts through the mist, his shadow stretching endlessly over the steppe. No name, no flag, no mercy. Within a few decades, his descendants would hold more land than any empire in human history, an empire forged not by diplomacy, but by devastation. They called him Genghis Khan, but once he was just a boy abandoned to die. How did a child of the steppes rise to become the conqueror of the known world? And what secrets did his empire hide that allowed it to endure when so many others burned to ash? Tonight, we'll uncover the truth behind the Mongol Empire, the blood, the brilliance, and the unbreakable code that built the largest empire ever known. Before we dive into the storm that reshaped history, subscribe to Elderly Stories Hub, because every empire hides a secret, and here we reveal them all. Let us now begin the complete documentary on Mongol Empire, The Untold Secrets of Genghis Khan's Ruthless Rise and Mysterious Legacy. The Mongolian steppe stretched endlessly under a pale sky, a wilderness of biting wind and shifting seasons where life was an unending struggle against nature itself. It was here, among the whispering grasses and frozen rivers, that a boy named Temujin was born. Not a prince, not a warrior, but the son of a minor tribal chief who could not have imagined the destiny waiting beyond the horizon. From the moment he opened his eyes, the world demanded strength, and every weakness was punished swiftly. Survival was the only religion on these lands, and mercy was a story told by the weak. When Temujin was still young, his father was poisoned by enemies who saw an opportunity to erase his bloodline. The death of his father shattered whatever fragile safety his family had known. Overnight, they were abandoned by their own tribe, left to die in the wilderness, stripped of every possession, betrayed by the same people who once swore loyalty. The cold became his companion, hunger his teacher. He watched his mother dig through frozen earth for roots to feed them, saw his brothers fight over scraps, and learned that trust was a blade that always cut deep. It was in these brutal years that the seed of Genghis Khan began to take root, not in privilege or inheritance, but in relentless suffering. He learned the rhythm of survival in silence. When he hunted, he moved like the wolves that stalked the steppe. He watched them carefully, how they waited, how they killed, how they never fought alone. There was order in their violence, purpose in their savagery. Temujin began to understand that unity, not strength alone, was the true weapon. The tribes of the Mongols were scattered, feuding, killing one another for water, horses, and pride. He saw that this chaos was why they were forever weak. He began to dream of something impossible, one Mongol nation, bound not by blood but by loyalty. But dreams on the steppe demanded blood. As Temujin grew, he faced betrayal again and again. Once, a trusted ally captured him and made him a slave, tying a wooden collar around his neck so heavy it bent his back. The humiliation burned into his soul, but it didn't break him. One night, when the guards grew careless, he escaped. As he fled into the darkness, he realized something profound, that freedom was not given, it was taken, and no man would ever hold his neck down again. From that moment, his will hardened into iron. He would bend the world before he bowed to it. Temujin began gathering men who had also been abandoned, the outcasts, the defeated, the forgotten. He promised them something no other chief had ever dared, that loyalty would outweigh lineage. It didn't matter who your father was, only what you could do. For men who had lived their lives under the shadow of privilege, this was revolution. They followed him not out of fear, but out of belief. And as his following grew, so did his enemies. He married Berta, a woman from another tribe, sealing his first true alliance. She was more than a wife. She was his partner in every sense. Her abduction by raiders only fueled his resolve. He raised a small force, hunted down her captors, and took her back. That moment was not just a rescue, it was a statement. No one would take from him again. Word began to spread across the steppe. Temujin, the wolf child, the man who would not be broken. He began to impose discipline among his warriors. The Mongols had always been free, chaotic riders, but Temujin saw that freedom without order was weakness. He organized his men into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, each one loyal directly to him, not to their tribal elders. It was a radical transformation, stripping away centuries of division. His soldiers were forbidden from stealing from the people they conquered, forbidden from hoarding food, and ordered to share everything equally. In a world where greed ruled every man's heart, Temujin built loyalty through fairness, a weapon far sharper than fear. But to unite the steppe, he had to destroy it first. Every tribe that refused to join him faced annihilation. Some called it cruelty. He called it necessity. If one tribe resisted and survived, others would follow, and his dream would die before it began. When his enemies surrendered, he absorbed them. When they betrayed him, he erased them from existence. Slowly, painfully, the tribes began to understand that the only future left was under his banner. And yet, even as he conquered, he never forgot the boy who starved in the cold. He rewarded loyalty with generosity and punished betrayal with death. Those who served him faithfully were elevated beyond their birth, given command, wealth, and honor. In a society that worshipped bloodlines, Temujin replaced nobility with merit. His closest generals came from humble beginnings, shepherds, hunters, even former enemies. It was unheard of, and it terrified the old world. When his power became undeniable, the tribal leaders gathered on the banks of the Onan River to make a decision. The air was heavy with the scent of burned wood and the whispers of history. Temujin stood before them, no longer a wandering warrior but a conqueror who had turned chaos into empire. One by one, the chiefs knelt and proclaimed him their leader. He was given a new name, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The moment marked the birth of a legend. He wasted no time transforming his people into a force the world had never seen. He established strict laws known as the Yasa, rules that bound every Mongol, rich or poor, under the same justice. Lying, theft, adultery, or cowardice in battle were punishable by death. His system created something extraordinary: trust. For the first time in Mongol history, a man could travel from one end of the steppe to the other without fear of being robbed or killed. It was not peace born of kindness, but of absolute control. Under his rule, the Mongols became a living weapon. Every warrior trained to ride from childhood, able to fire arrows accurately while galloping at full speed. Each carried multiple horses, able to move faster and farther than any army alive. They communicated through a network of signals and messengers that allowed orders to travel hundreds of miles in hours. It was efficiency that bordered on supernatural precision. But perhaps his greatest strength was his understanding of people. Genghis Khan didn't see loyalty as permanent. He saw it as something earned and reinforced. When he defeated a tribe, he offered them a choice: join him or die. Most joined, and in doing so, they became part of something greater than themselves. The empire that rose from the dust was not built on Mongol blood alone, but on the bones of every tribe that had once been an enemy. By the time his armies were ready to move beyond Mongolia, Genghis Khan had forged not just a nation but an identity. The Mongols were no longer scattered clans. They were one people, bound by purpose. They looked to their Khan not as a chief, but as the embodiment of destiny. Every victory, every conquest, every law pointed toward one truth: that he was chosen by the eternal blue sky, the divine spirit that watched over the steppe. The rise of Genghis Khan was not a tale of chance or luck. It was the deliberate creation of a man who turned suffering into strength, betrayal into wisdom, and chaos into empire. The boy who once dug roots from frozen earth now commanded thousands of riders who would burn cities to ash at a single word. And yet, beneath the armor and legend, he remained what he had always been: a survivor. A wolf born from hunger, leading a pack that would soon devour the world. The storm that began in the Mongolian steppe gathered force as it rolled across the face of the world. What had started as scattered tribes welded together under one man's will had become an unstoppable tide of conquest. Genghis Khan stood at the center of it all, his vision stretching far beyond the horizon. To him, conquest was not chaos. It was order, the reshaping of a fractured world into a single system governed by his law. Every war he fought, every city he burned, was part of a larger design. He did not simply want to rule. He wanted to control the pulse of the earth itself. The first great test of his new empire came against the Tangut, kingdom of Western Xia. The Tanguts had long considered themselves the masters of trade routes and mountain passes, untouched by the violence of the steppe. When Genghis Khan's messengers arrived demanding submission, the Tangut rulers dismissed them as mere barbarians. Their arrogance sealed their fate. The Mongol armies descended like a winter storm. For the first time, the world witnessed the full might of Genghis Khan's machine. Tens of thousands of mounted archers moving with terrifying coordination, striking like lightning and vanishing before the enemy could even form ranks. The Tangut capital, with its high walls and proud towers, fell under siege. The Mongols built massive siege engines, catapults, and towers using captured engineers from China, combining nomadic speed with the technology of their enemies. When the city finally fell, its wealth was plundered, its leaders executed, and its population scattered. The lesson was clear: submission brought mercy, defiance brought extinction. But this was only the beginning. To the east lay the mighty Jin Empire of northern China, a realm rich, ancient, and arrogant. For centuries, the Jin had looked down upon the Mongols as uncivilized wanderers. Genghis Khan turned that contempt into his weapon. He studied his enemy meticulously, sending spies disguised as traders and monks deep into Jin territory to map their defenses and understand their politics. He discovered that the Jin relied heavily on fortified cities and bureaucratic systems, while their armies moved slowly, burdened by tradition and hierarchy. He realized that if he could break their rhythm, the empire would collapse from within. His campaign against the Jin was a masterpiece of adaptation. He split his forces into multiple divisions, sending them in different directions to confuse the enemy. His armies appeared, disappeared, and reappeared miles away in impossible time. When the Jin army advanced to meet them, they found nothing but empty plains. When they retreated, the Mongols struck from the rear. It was not just warfare, it was psychological domination. The Jin generals began to fear the very shadows on the horizon. Entire armies surrendered without a fight, unable to face an enemy they could neither see nor predict. The siege of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, would become a symbol of this new era of warfare. For months, the Mongols encircled the city, cutting off supplies and terrorizing its defenders. Genghis Khan understood that fear was more powerful than arrows. He sent captured prisoners ahead of his army to spread stories of massacres, of cities turned to ash, of rivers running red. Inside Zhongdu, panic replaced courage. When the city finally fell, it was consumed by fire so intense that the smoke blotted out the sun. The Jin emperor fled south, leaving behind a ruined capital and a shattered people. For Genghis Khan, it was not victory alone. It was validation that his strategy of calculated terror could move mountains. After China came the lands of Central Asia, where the Khwarezmian Empire ruled with wealth and arrogance. Genghis Khan had no intention of war at first. He sent a caravan of merchants carrying silk, gold, and messages of peace to the Shah of Khwarezm. But the Shah, suspicious and proud, saw an insult where there was none. Believing the Mongols to be beneath him, he ordered the caravan seized and its men executed. When Genghis Khan learned of this, his rage became legend. He sent envoys to demand justice, and the Shah responded by murdering them too, an act that would unleash one of the greatest retaliations in history. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm was not a campaign of conquest. It was an act of vengeance shaped into an empire's weapon. Genghis Khan divided his army into multiple wings, striking simultaneously across thousands of miles. His enemies could not comprehend how he moved so fast. His generals, Subutai and Jabi, became ghosts in the desert, appearing at one border, disappearing at another, encircling cities before the defenders even realized they were under attack. The Khwarezmian cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench fell one after another. When Genghis Khan entered Bukhara, he gathered the citizens in their mosque and spoke words that burned into history. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." He left no doubt about his purpose. The destruction was total. Cities that resisted were burned to the ground. Their rulers executed, their people enslaved. But those who surrendered quickly were spared and even rewarded. The Shah fled westward, chased across mountains and deserts until he died in exile, broken and forgotten. Genghis Khan had turned insult into empire, yet behind the horror there was method. He was not a mad conqueror, but a ruler with a vision of order. Wherever the Mongols went, they enforced laws, reopened trade routes, and established communication systems. Caravan routes once plagued by bandits became safe under his command. Merchants from Persia to China began to move freely again, paying tribute to the empire that guaranteed their passage. It was a paradox. The same army that destroyed civilizations also connected them in ways unseen before. Genghis Khan's strategy relied not only on strength, but on intelligence. He built one of the earliest organized spy networks in history. His agents infiltrated courts, mapped terrains, studied languages, and reported on political divisions. Every campaign began long before the first arrow was shot. By the time his armies arrived, they already knew their enemies' weaknesses, resources, and escape routes. Even communication between his generals was revolutionary. He used mounted couriers and signal fires that could transmit orders over vast distances in hours. No army on Earth had ever moved with such precision. The empire's military structure was another stroke of genius. Instead of relying on tribal hierarchies, Genghis Khan created units based on merit. A common herdsman could rise to command thousands if he proved his skill and loyalty. This meritocracy built a sense of purpose among the ranks, transforming ordinary men into devoted soldiers. They believed they were part of something greater, a divine mission under the eternal blue sky. As the Mongol conquests expanded, so did their cultural absorption. Genghis Khan understood the value of knowledge. He spared artisans, scholars, and engineers wherever he went, transporting them across his empire to build cities, fortifications, and new technologies. Chinese engineers taught siegecraft to Persians. Persian administrators brought order to Mongolian governance. The empire became a living network of human intelligence and innovation. By the time Genghis Khan's armies reached the edges of Europe, word of his approach traveled faster than his riders. Villages fled before they arrived. Kings prayed for divine intervention. The Mongols had become more than men. They were a legend written in fear. Yet for Genghis Khan, this was not merely conquest for conquest's sake. He believed he was fulfilling destiny, bringing the scattered nations of the world under one eternal law. In 1227, as he led his final campaign against the Tanguts once more, Genghis Khan fell ill. He would never return to the steppe that had birthed him. But his empire now stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, covering lands that no single ruler had ever united before. His final orders were for his death to be hidden, his body buried in secret, his grave unmarked, so that his spirit would roam freely beneath the sky he had worshipped all his life. What remained after his death was not just a trail of ashes, but a blueprint for domination that would endure long after his bones turned to dust. His generals, his sons, and his grandsons would take that blueprint and carve it across continents. The storm that began on the steppe had consumed half the world, and yet it had only just begun to move west. When Genghis Khan breathed his last, the steppe fell silent. The winds carried whispers of his death, but no one knew where his body lay. His funeral procession rode deep into the Mongolian wilderness, slaughtering everything in its path, animals, travelers, even birds overhead, so that no living being could reveal the route to his grave. The location of his tomb was buried in secrecy, lost beneath the eternal blue sky he worshipped. Yet while the man had vanished, his vision had not. The empire he built did not die with him. It transformed, reshaping itself into something larger than any single ruler. What Genghis Khan began as a war for survival had become a system that would define the next century of human history. After his death in 1227, the empire passed to his sons and grandsons, each inheriting a portion of the vast dominion he had carved from the bones of nations. At the heart of this division was his third son, Ogedei, chosen as the Great Khan. Unlike his father, Ogedei was not a warrior by nature, but an administrator, a builder. He understood that an empire won by the sword could only be kept by structure and order. Under his rule, the Mongol Empire began to take shape as a civilization rather than a swarm of conquest. He built the city of Karakorum in the heart of Mongolia, transforming the steppe into a seat of global power. Merchants, ambassadors, and scholars from every corner of the known world came there to pay tribute, trade goods, and share ideas. But the Mongols never forgot their origins. The memory of Genghis Khan was not just honored, it was treated as divine. His name became a symbol of fate, his commands immortalized in law. Every conquest that followed was carried out in his name, as though his spirit guided the empire from beyond the grave. The unity he had forged among the tribes continued to hold, bound by the same code of discipline and fear that he had instilled. And yet the hunger that drove him did not fade, it grew. The Mongol Empire still believed it was destined to rule the world. Under Ogedei, the Mongol armies surged westward once more, this time into Eastern Europe. The great generals Subutai and Batu Khan led the charge, their armies moving with the same terrifying precision that had destroyed kingdoms in Asia. Poland, Hungary, and parts of Russia fell under the thunder of hooves. Cities burned, kings fled. The Mongols reached as far as the borders of Vienna before turning back, not because they were defeated, but because the Great Khan had died. The warriors retreated to elect a new leader, bound by their ancient law that no campaign could continue without the counsel of all Khans. Even in death, the discipline Genghis had forged dictated the actions of his empire. While the Western Front expanded, the Eastern territories evolved. Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai, perhaps the most ambitious of his descendants, set his eyes on China. The conquest of the Southern Song dynasty would become one of the most significant campaigns in Mongol history. It was not a swift destruction like the earlier wars, but a long, calculated struggle that blended brute force with political maneuvering. Kublai understood something his grandfather had sensed but never lived to see, that true power did not lie in burning cities but in ruling them. When he finally conquered China, he declared himself emperor and founded the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols, once dismissed as wild horsemen, now ruled one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. Under Kublai's reign, the Mongol Empire entered a new phase. Roads, trade routes, and communication networks connected lands from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. The Silk Road, long fractured by wars, was revived and expanded under Mongol protection. Caravans carried silk, gold, spices, and ideas across thousands of miles. A merchant could travel from Beijing to Baghdad without fear of bandits or border taxes, shielded by the authority of the Great Khan. This new system of global exchange laid the foundation for the modern world. It was the first true age of international connectivity, an empire of movement and knowledge. Yet this prosperity came at a price. Beneath the order lay a shadow that refused to fade. The Mongols had not forgotten the cruelty that built their empire, and neither had the world. Entire civilizations still bore the scars of their conquest. Fields once fertile lay barren, cities that had thrived for centuries existed only as ruins. In Persia, entire regions were depopulated. In Russia, centuries of Mongol dominance, known as the Tatar yoke, shaped its history and delayed its emergence as a unified nation. Even as trade and culture flourished, the legacy of blood haunted the empire's name. Still, the Mongols had accomplished something no empire before them had achieved. They had made the vast and fractured world into one interconnected organism. Scholars, engineers, and doctors moved across borders as freely as merchants. Chinese printing techniques reached the Middle East. Persian astronomy influenced the East. The Mongols adopted paper currency, postal systems, and diplomatic immunity for travelers. Ideas that once belonged to isolated cultures now belonged to the world. In this paradox, the spirit of Genghis Khan endured. His empire, though born of violence, had become a vessel for human progress. But like every great power, the Mongol Empire could not escape the decay of time. The vastness that had once been its strength became its weakness. Communication between far-flung territories broke down. Local rulers grew ambitious, loyal more to their own wealth than to the great Khan. The empire fractured into 4 great Khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each claimed to preserve Genghis Khan's legacy, yet each pursued its own destiny. The unity that had once terrified the world dissolved into rivalries and internal strife. The fall came quietly. No great battle marked the end of Mongol supremacy. Instead, the empire eroded slowly, piece by piece. The Ilkhanate succumbed to civil war and famine. The Golden Horde was weakened by rebellion and the rising power of Moscow. The Chagatai Khanate splintered into fragments. And in China, the Yuan dynasty collapsed under the weight of corruption and rebellion, replaced by the Ming. By the end of the 14th century, the Mongol Empire that had once stretched from ocean to ocean was gone, leaving only echoes. Yet the legacy of Genghis Khan did not vanish with his empire. His influence endured in the systems he created, in the trade routes that continued to thrive, in the cultural exchanges that reshaped continents. Even in defeat, the Mongols had changed the world's geography, economy, and imagination. They had forced civilizations to adapt, to defend, to innovate. The Renaissance that later bloomed in Europe owed part of its spark to the flow of knowledge that had traveled across Mongol roads. Centuries later, the image of Genghis Khan still divides historians. Some see a tyrant who brought unimaginable destruction. Others see a visionary who broke the walls that separated East from West. The truth lies somewhere in between. He was both destroyer and builder, barbarian and statesman. His empire was carved in fire, but from its ashes rose a world more connected, more aware, and more complex than before. In Mongolia today, his name is spoken not with fear but with reverence. Statues rise from the plains where his horse once rode. His face adorns currency, his story fills classrooms. To his descendants, he remains the father of their nation, the embodiment of endurance and will. To the rest of the world, he is the shadow that still looms over history, the man who reshaped civilization by sheer force of will. Beneath the same vast sky that once watched him conquer the world, the wind still whispers through the grasslands. No one knows where he is buried, but perhaps that is fitting. His empire was never meant to rest in one place. It lived in motion, in expansion, in transformation, and in a way it never truly died. Every trade route, every empire that followed carried a trace of him. The boy who starved on the steppe, who rose to command nations, who dreamed of a world united under one law. His story is the story of humanity itself. Brutal, brilliant, and unending. The ashes of his empire have long been scattered by time, yet the silence of the Mongolian plain still feels heavy, as though it remembers every scream, every victory, every oath whispered beneath the eternal blue sky. His bloodline faded into history. His cities turned to dust, but his shadow remains, a reminder that power is never truly buried, only waiting to rise again. And as the wind carries whispers of forgotten empires, one question lingers, haunting the edge of history. If the greatest conqueror the world has ever known could vanish without a trace, what other empires are still hiding their secrets beneath the sand?